All right, so what we're gonna do today is we're gonna build something very basic, just a very simple web form. We're gonna have like name, password, and an OK button. And if I type in like Jim Kirk and type in like just some nonsense for password, hit OK, we'll have like a simple thank you message, say something. But we're also gonna take it a step further. We'll actually start off with having the OK button redirect to a new page that'll be a thank you page. So the purpose today is just to get our feet wet with Visual Studio and ASP.NET and just get comfortable with the language as it is. So first thing we'll do is we will launch Visual Studio. All right, so with Visual Studio, when you guys are building Windows Forms, you would typically say File and New, and you would say New Project. Now you could do that still here, but the problem with that is they add a lot of extra stuff that we won't really need. So we're going to go File, New Website, so the one below it. So for all the websites we're going to build in ASP.NET here, for this half of the course, we're going to do a website. And so this comes up with a menu here. So first thing you have to note is that Visual C# must be highlighted because we're doing a C# course. We're not doing Visual Basic. So we got to make sure it's not highlighted. If you accidentally have Visual Basic, you'll see all you're going to see are VB files, right? We don't want that. We want .cs files for our stuff we're building. So we could do ASP.NET empty website, a web form site, a website. Now Razor v3, this is for something called Model View Controller, or MVC. This is a new style that Microsoft is pushing. We're going to stick to web forms for our stuff here. So we're going to actually choose empty website. All right, so we're going to choose ASP.empty website. Now at the bottom, we're going to specify where it's going to go. So I'll hit browse, and you guys will give it a home. So I'm just going to take a moment and place it somewhere. And it might ask you to create a new folder. You can go ahead and say yes. And then once you have it, you just hit OK. So ASP.NET empty website, hit OK. Okay, so let's look at the page here, the screen here. We basically have our website name. We're calling it week 8. And we have a file called web.config. So web.config is sort of a configuration file for how you want your website to work, or your web application to work. So the default information that is preloaded is typically, what's your target .NET framework? In this case, is 4.5.2 for me. But other settings could be set here, such as your connection string could go here. Maybe any login specific information go here. If you bring in an external program or an external library to help you out with your website, that could go here. So a lot of information can go here to help configure the web application that you're building. We're not going to touch web config today, so we're going to leave that alone. What we need to do is add a web page. So web pages in the ASP.NET world are called web forms. So we're going to right click on our week 8 and say add new item. So right click, say add new item, and this comes up. And so what we want to do is, we don't want an HTML page, we actually just want a web form. And you got to, again, make sure that Visual C# is highlighted, and you'll see over here that all of these say Visual C#. The only other option is Visual Basic. We don't want Visual Basic here. So we're choosing web form, and down here under name, it says default.aspx. So by default, in the HTML world, we know that a default page or a home page is typically called index.html. Well, in the ASP.NET world, it's called default.aspx. Right? So since we have no other default home page, we'll call it default.aspx. So that's good enough. Before we hit add, over here there's a little checkbox that says place code in separate file. We want to make sure that's checked. We want to have our separate C# file so we can actually write our C# code. And we're going to see how the C# file and the ASP file work hand in hand. So now that this is checked, We have our name. We're using a web form. We'll just hit add. And it comes up with this web page. And we have three options or three ways to view it. So we have source, we have split, and we have design. Right? So this design would basically look like a blank page. Right? There's nothing there, but we can still use it. And you're going to find it's convenient to switch between the two styles to make it easy for you to design your web page. I typically lay out my Project Explorer, my Solution Explorer here, and below it I have my properties over here. So that's the way I typically lay out my page. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a label. So on the side, I typically put my toolbox here. You can add your toolbox by saying view and then toolbox if you don't already have it. All right? But I typically have my toolbox here. And so if I open up my toolbox, I really just want a label and a text box. So I'll start off with my label. And it drags a label over here. All right? And a default text is label. Default ID is label as well, or label 1. If I switch back to source, I could drag it as well over here too. So let me start off by expanding this so we can see all of it. Right? So I dragged a label. So let's look at the tag here. This isn't a typical label tag. You'll notice that it says ASP:label. So all ASP controls start with ASP: and then something. So ASP: text box, ASP: grid view, ASP: drop down, and so on. Right? So everything starts with ASP:. Right? Everything has an ID. So if you recall from the Windows Forms world, all the controls you dragged onto your Windows form had an ID, and you changed that name to be something more suitable. So I'm going to call this LBL name. Right? So LBL name will be the ID for this label. The next thing says run at equals server. Every form control says run at equals server. It's always there. So you never change this, you never modify it, you just leave it alone and let it be. The next, in this case, is text equals label. So this is the actual text for the label. So I'm going to change this to be name, colon, and then space. And then you'll notice that the closing tag is /ASP:label. Right? So you're closing your typical closing tag that you would have seen in HTML. So this is a simple ASP label control. Right? So the next thing I want to bring in is a text box. So I'll just put this back here. And I'll drag a text box over. And put it right next to it. And so you'll say ASP:text box. I'm going to call this TB name. And it says run at equals server. All right. And if I look at design, let's see how it's laid out. So it has name and it has a text box. Maybe I'll hit enter and I want to put a password field below. So I could actually just type in password and it would work as normal. But I'm using labels today for everything just to keep things consistent. So I'm going to drag another label here. And this time around I'm going to use the properties. So we use the code to edit our code directly. But if I don't feel like doing that, if I feel like just dragging stuff on here, I can use properties to change those properties. Right? So text, I'm going to change the text to say password here. Right? And I'll change the ID under properties to be LBL password. And if I look inside source, it will have edited that as well for me as too. So ID is LBL password, text is just password colon. Now, the next thing I need is a text box to go with password. So I'll drag over a text box. right? And I'll do the same thing here. I'll just edit the ID. This will be TB password. And let's change the style because passwords are typically hidden. So if I go back to text mode and I expand that, the default is just a single line input. There's multi-line if you want to have like maybe an address field instead. Password is what we'll choose, but just before we choose password, you can see that there's other options here like email, month, number, range, and so on. So I'm going to choose password. All right. Maybe I'll hit enter again to add some more space. And let's look at how the code looks behind. So under source, we have TB password, run at server, text mode is password. I notice that there's break tags being inserted for me automatically as I hit enter. So it's automatically editing the page for me as well. So one thing I'll note is that with the password field, if I expand the password, like maybe stretch out the password field and look back at source, it modifies the width for me as well. So width is now 217 pixels. Right? So it automatically in real time updates everything for me. Let's see how things look. So if I right click on default.aspx and I say view in browser, for me the default browser is Firefox. It will load the page for me. Now, it says here localhost 52804/default.aspx, and it'll give me a wonderful pop-up. Thank you, pop-up. And it'll say default.aspx. So it's using IIS, so Internet Information Server, and it's essentially piggybacking off that at port 52804. It's loading default.aspx, and this is what we see. There's two approaches to launching a web page. That was the first approach. The second approach was to just hit the play button, right? So the little play button here. In this case, default is Firefox. I can change that to any other browser, right? I'll just hit Firefox and it'll load. The difference between the two is that if I just want to see the quick fix I made, then I'll just do view in browser. If I want to do some debugging, right, it's still the same page, then I'll hit the play button, right, and I'll do the stop button afterwards, right? So far so good. So far we have name and password, all right? Let's add a button, a little go button. And so what I want to do is go to Toolbox. In fact, actually, I'll use Design this time around. So I had a little space down here for a button. So I'm going to hit Toolbox, look for button, drag a button, throw it there, and I have a little button there. Now, one thing to note is that if I'm going to add a button, I'm typically going to add an event handler, right? So I'm going to double click on that button, but I always want to change the ID first because by default, the ID is button 1, right? And that's not very helpful as an event handler name. So first thing I'll do here is change the text to just say OK. And then the second thing I'll do is change the ID from button 1, call it BTN OK. All right, so we have BTN OK. Now I can actually double click on the button and create my event handler. So I'm going to double click on OK. And it'll generate BTN OK _ click. So I have my click event handler. Now where did this page come from? Well, if I expand default.aspx, I have default.aspx.cs. So it organizes the files for me nicely. So if I have an ASP file, it has the corresponding CS file that go hand in hand with it. All right, we'll talk more about this CS file in a moment, but essentially we have our event handler here. All right, so next step now is let's create a new page and let's redirect to that new page. So I'm going to right click on week 8 and say add new item. And I'll do another Windows web form. Sorry, not Windows form, web form. And you'll see that it's trying to call it default2.aspx. I'm going to call this one thankyou.aspx. So thankyou.aspx. I'll still keep the place code and separate file checked. We're not going to really do anything with this page other than put the word thank you on it, and that's it. So we're going to keep it really simple. So it's a web form called thankyou.aspx, and we'll hit add. And inside of it, maybe I'll use design. I'll just say thank you. That's it. All right. Okay. So that's it for thank you. I'm not going to touch anything else with the thank you file. I want to set it up so that when I click on the OK button, it goes to this page. And it's really easy to do with one line of code. So if I go back to default.aspx.cs, I have my event handler, btnok_click. I'm going to type in this one line of code that'll basically say go to this new page. So that line of code is response.redirect. And inside, I'm going to provide the file name I want to redirect to in quotes because it's a string. So I'm going to say thankyou.aspx. And now you can actually run it and give it a try. So I'm going to right click on default.aspx and say view in browser. And it'll load. And so I'll just type in, Jim Kirk, some nonsense password, and hit OK. And it just goes to the new page called thank you. All right. All right. So now that we've learned how to redirect to a new page, I'm actually going to comment out this line of code, response.redirect. Right? We're not going to use it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that we have a little thank you message come up on the home page next to the OK button. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Let's add a new label to default.aspx. So next to the OK button, I'm going to have a little label that just says thank you. So under toolbar or toolbox, I'm going to add a label. Put it right next to the OK button. And I'm going to change this text to thank you. With a little space at the end of it. And the ID will be called LBL thanks. All right. And furthermore, I'm going to hide this label. So under visible, I'm going to change this to false. So it'll be invisible. And if I run this right now, we'll see that the OK button has nothing next to it. All right, so we have nothing next to it. And in fact, hitting OK does nothing as well. In fact, just to notice, when I hit OK, it does something and it comes back. So that's my post back right there. Like it's going back to the server, it's saying, hey, what do I do now? Even though there's nothing to do. But essentially right now our thing is invisible. What we're going to do is we're going to set it up so we have a little thank you message for whoever typed in their name. So I'm going to switch over to the C# code, and I'm going to write the code to get that thank you message working. So instead of this btn OK, I'm going to first retrieve the thank you message from the label. So I'll say string thanks message, or MSG, equals LBL thanks dot text. All right, that's the first thing. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to append the person's name that was entered to the thanks message. So I'm going to say thanks message equals thanks message plus LBL name dot text. And then I'm going to feed that back into my LBL thanks. So I'm going to say LBL thanks dot text equals thanks MSG. And the last step I'll do is to make it visible. So I'll say LBL thanks dot visible equals true. All right. So essentially, we're going to basically say thank you and then Jim Kirk, for example. All right. So when we hit OK, we're going to do that, as opposed to redirecting to a separate thank you page. So just going to run that. So I'll right-click on default, say View in Browser. And I'll say Jim Kirk. Put some nonsense password. Hit OK. And it'll say, thank you, name. Whoops. Let's fix that. That was supposed to be tbname.text. All right, how embarrassing. tbname.text. View in browser. Let's try that again. So we'll say Jim Kirk. Put some nonsense password. Hit OK. Thank you, Jim Kirk. All right, so there's one last thing we're going to talk about, and it's inside the C# class. So let's expand this to go full screen. Let's talk about this CS file in particular. So we have our usings. So we're bringing in all of our using stuff. We're adding stuff in. But all of a sudden we say public partial class, called it default, right? Is a child class of system.web.ui.page. We have this method here called page load. Now, this can be considered like the constructor for the page. If you ever have default code you want to execute on the page, you put it inside page load. So in essence, we're able to auto-execute code we need to auto-execute, such as, maybe we want to make a database connection, which we'll do in a couple of weeks, right? Be able to retrieve data automatically from a web page or our data set, right? Or a database, whatever we want to do. We can do that automatically in page load. There's actually 4 methods in total that handle page work. So essentially page load is like the constructor. There's 3 others that we're going to talk about in a future class. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to play with this such that we just change the name, or sorry, the text of the name text box to something else. So I'm just going to, just to prove that it works, I'm going to say tbname.text equals say something. Right? And so right now, up until now, we've just been seeing an empty text box. All right, so just to illustrate that, now we'll just run it one more time. And you should see say something under the name text box. So say something is right here.